Hi, I'm Cody Alexander of MatchQuarters. Welcome to another The ArtofX show. Today, we're going to take a review from the NFL season this year. We're going to project forward into the offseason. Not going to really talk draft. We are going to talk coaching changes. What are the trends that we're seeing? Primarily coverage usage. Remember, we're in the age of the spread. We're post-spread era now. So we're kind of 5 years removed from 2018 as what I consider when the spread won in the NFL. And so now we've kind of come to the point where we are seeing kind of that equilibrium. Defenses are kind of back equal. So what are the trends that we're going to see going forward? What are things defenses are doing? And then I really think you can tell from the hiring cycle kind of where NFL teams are. And this year was no different. I think we really saw kind of a trend going in one direction. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So NFL defensive trends, let's get into it. What are we seeing? Let's look at the review. I think the big argument that we're going to have postseason and coaches are going to be having in their meeting rooms is the argument of static versus movement. You have static defenses like the Cowboys, the Jets, even the Texans, who kind of who finished in the middle of the road in DVOA, and kind of the king of the static defense is really going to be the 49ers, who were able to get into the Super Bowl. Now, the argument that you're going to have is, well, look what happened in the Super Bowl, and I do agree with you. You have a movement offense in the Chiefs. Now, they are not in terms of quick movement or snap movement, which is somebody is moving at the snap of the ball. That is not necessarily what the Chiefs do. They do use jet motions and push motions and all of that. But in terms of comparing them to the Shanahan-McVay system, Andy Reid rather would use kind of these short shifts, these short motions, really to give Mahomes kind of a coverage ID without wholesale, like, hey, we're going to put the back all the way out and empty, and then we're just going to move him back in. Or with the 49ers, all these jet motions that tie into the run game, where one of the knocks on the Shanahan system is its drop back passing game, which we saw again in the Super Bowl. That translates to defense as well. You have defenses like, Dan Quinn's defense in Dallas here now is going to move into the Commanders. That is very static. The Jets are kind of relatively static. What does static mean? Because I think that's important, because we're just using a word, then it's just jargon and you have no idea what that actually means. I think when people see static, they mean they literally are not doing anything. They're just plugging gaps, they're playing coverage, and that's what it is. And yes, to a point, that is what I am talking about. But in reality, what we're talking about is low blitz rate, low stunt rate, low middle of the field coverage changes or disguises during the play. So essentially what you're getting is 75 to 80% of the time when a defense lines up, that's exactly where that defense is going to be. That's where we get this static from. Then you have movement-based defenses, which are going to be switching up coverages post-snap. They're going to be pressuring you, mostly simulated pressures or even five-man pressures with middle of the field coverage behind it, because what you're trying to do is what I call passive pressure. So you are applying pressure in other ways other than directly just blitzing. I think when we use the term pressure, that's what so many people think of. The first word that you think of when I say pressure is blitz, right? And so then in your mind, you're just imagining the first blitz that maybe your favorite blitz. That's what we're talking about. And that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. I'm talking about post-snap movement from a two-high shell or a single-high shell, running simulated pressures, running creepers that are basically replacement pressures. Now, I always get asked, what's the difference between a simulated pressure and what is a creeper? Now, both of those can be lumped together in a certain bucket. In fact, some coaching staffs will do that. They'll put a creeper in a simulated pressure because you are simulating a five-man pressure or a six-man pressure, but then dropping out first-level defenders to create force. So it's really just semantics. It's whatever you want to talk about. So static versus movement, I think, is going to be the number one thing in talked about is, do you have to do something on defense other than play, sit, and get? At the NFL level, you can play, sit, and get sometimes, because if you have an excellent defensive line, primarily interior defensive line, you can do that. The rise of cover one, this is going to be interesting because we're going to talk about this later in the podcast, is that the cover one rates have actually dropped in the NFL. and they've consistently dropped the past 5-6 years. That's because of what we're seeing on the offensive side. But the caveat to this is we have teams this year that really did well when running cover one. I'm actually surprised that the 49ers didn't run cover one more than they did in the Super Bowl. They actually defaulted to zone, which is what they've primarily been running. So you have a team like the Browns, for instance, that were heavy into cover one. They were dominant for most of the year. So you're going to have people go back and you're going to, this is what typically happens is, okay, who's got the most tackles for loss? Who's got the most sacks? Who's running an anomaly in the coverage? Who's the top DVOA? Who's the top EPA in pass? And they're going to go and look at this, and the Browns are going to show up a lot. Now, they have a good defensive line. They have great coverage skill ability in the back end. So if Schwartz really leaned into the cover one, and he's kind of a 4-down, aggressive, gap out, he's single high guy. And that's in cover one translates really well to that. So the Browns, I think, are going to kind of give us a look at, okay, can we start maybe running a little bit more cover one? We saw a rise in 2019 as a reaction to the RPOs from 17 and 18. People were getting gashed because offenses were like, fine, we'll just run all our man beaters. And then they kind of went away from it, and we've actually dropped in usage. The other part is everybody remembers the last game. And so everybody's going to go back to the Chiefs. They're going to watch them playing cover one against the Shanahan McVay system, right? And they're all going to ask, well, maybe that's the answer to this. I do think that there are some interesting teams, such as the Lions, for instance, were heavy cover one last year. They weren't very good at it. So what do? They run more quarters. In fact, they were able to beat the Chiefs in the first week of the season. I wrote about that in their use of their stubby special against the Chiefs. I'll make sure to link that in the bottom. So do we see a tick up in cover one? I think that's going to be a good question. And then we have Fangio versus the new Ravens. Now, the Raven system has been around forever, and so it's a mix of Dom Capers, Dick LeBeau, Rex Ryan. We kind of mash this all together, and what we come out with is a guy like Wink Martindale, who's very blitz heavy, single high coverage, wants to play a lot of man. But you then are kind of countered that with the Mike Macdonald, who is more of a passive pressure guy. So let's simulate pressure. Let's make sure that we're rotating our coverage choices, that we're not constantly doing the same thing. I think if you watch the Ravens, you would see a defense that is very well coached. So we still have these kind of two defensive camps of where I still think Fangio is important. I think playing from a too high shell, playing multiple coverages. I think his targeted coverages where you are rotating the cover two side depending on either alignment of the offense or a primary person, which is called in theirs is called a Zeus tag. So Zeus would be your primary receiver. You're going to roll the coverage to them, whether if they're the single receiver or they're the two receiver side. And there's a whole bunch of coverage checks. I'll make sure to also link that article in there. So Fangio versus the new Ravens, I think that's going to be, this is where we are defensively. I think Spagnuolo also will get a lot of looks, and we'll talk about him later in the podcast. So quickly, let's transition to the 5-year coverage review. We are seeing more middle of the field open coverages. We are getting closer and closer to 50-50 usage. So our cover zero rates actually went up this year. You can thank the Vikings for that. And technically it wasn't really even covered zero. They were running what's called hot quarters, which is essentially, I call that a key coverage. You're keying number two. If it's a screen, if it's a short route, we're keeping everything underneath of us. We're having a 5 or 6 man rush, and we're basically playing sticks coverage, and we're attacking everything downhill. So you did see a rise in cover zero usage, and it relatively fluctuates around 3.5 to close to 4, a little over 4%. And it kind of just fluctuates. And it's really just kind of where people are in the year. But this year it dropped in 2022 to 3.6 from 4.3% in 2021, and then rose back up to 4.2% this year. And a lot of those snaps are going to be from the Minnesota Vikings. So we did talk about the decline in cover one usage. In fact, we have gone down almost 10 percentage points. In fact, over 10 percentage points since 2019. We were at 30.1% in 2019, and we've dropped now down to 19.2% according to PFF in cover one. Cover three is still a dominant scheme. In fact, cover three has risen in the last 5 years. Why is that? We are seeing less cover one. So teams are opting to play more zone coverage than they are man coverage. So it's not that middle of the field close is back, right? Or middle of the close was ever dead. It's just that we are transitioning from man to zone, and primarily a lot of spot drop zone because of the NFL is different because of the field. Everything is played in the middle of the field. And because everything's played in the middle of the field, you have a lot of condensed sets. And so you're able to kind of get to spots and then play match coverage under that. I do think zone match is something that a lot of teams are going to start really getting into, is kind of underneath players playing zone. We're going to kind of cap verticals with the DBs, kind of that way we have DBs on receivers and we're not getting these shots of like linebackers trying to trail speedy receivers, especially like a guy like Tyreek Hill. You're going to want to have something. I think weak rotation cover three has become really, really important. And that's why I think our quarter systems have also started to become more and more prevalent, is because when you start running weak rotation cover three, you have to start building in what are basically quarters rules within that to keep your first level defender or your linebacker out of constantly carrying verticals. It's who do you want as the 3-up player? I've talked about this before when we've talked about cover three. Who do I want as a 3-up player? That player is going to be very, very important. That's why, again, I think weak rotation cover three, cutting the cross with a high safety already there from a 2-high shell. That's why we're seeing more cover three, and then it also being paired with quarters, because what we saw is a decline back to where we have our normal numbers in cover two. Typically in 19 and 20, we saw 10% usage, a little over it. We bump up to 11.2, so a whole percentage point in 21 and 22, and then we were back down to 10.4. I personally think we are not going to see a lot of just true clips of cover two. I think 10% is about where teams feel comfortable enough if you look at it historically. Why is that? Is because the middle of the field is open. Now, are we seeing more non-traditional Tampas where safeties are now the high hole player? We've got overlapping corners. We're doing things like that. Yes, I do think that that's where we're going to stabilize in cover two. Condensed sets are always a good opportunity to run cover two, just because if you get a lot of mesh, you get a lot of these smash concepts where we get double or bench routes where we're getting double outs outside. Cover two matches up really well with that. So we took a whole almost a percentage point low in cover two. I don't think cover two is dead. I just think that teams are transitioning away from it and running more quarters and then more targeted coverage. This is where the Fangio system comes into play. Couple years ago, 5 years ago, it was only really the Fangio crew that was running quarter, half, quarter, which is his cover 8 and cover 6. So you were seeing these targeted coverages really only from him. We see 2019, 2018, we start seeing a transition higher, right? 2019, we're at 6.3%. It's at quarter, half, right? Or the other variation, half, quarter, cover 6, cover 8, 7%, 8%, 8.4, and then 9.2. So we are now getting closer and closer to that 10% usage, which means it's going to be something that teams are primarily using. Now, we still only have a few teams that are really kind of leaning into this targeted coverage stuff. Obviously, the Fangio crew, but then also this Ravens crew that's coming through is now going to have it. So I project this number to be higher. I think quarters will also be higher. Quarters answers a lot of problems, especially when you need to just cap receivers. You can have guys underneath. You need to load the box. This is 9-man spacing quarters, right, where we're playing made quarters outside. Essentially, you're getting cover zero. I think a lot of these cover zero two are also teams just kind of playing made quarters against teams that have running quarterbacks. But the quarters usage is going up. And here's the thing. It was really interesting. This past weekend, I was at the Lone Star Clinic. I heard the defense coordinator for SMU to talk about his kind of philosophy on why they run zone coverages. And then I also talked to, I heard the SFA, Mike Moots, who comes from Tulane. I talked to him a little bit about his philosophy on kind of where they are with their match coverages. And one thing that I noticed, and I think that this translates to the NFL a lot because the less time that they have with players, is we're going to see more zone match and more just spot drop zone. But I think it's not going to be the old school where we know we're dropping to a spot because that's where the West Coast offense is sitting, because obviously we've kind of moved away from that. We all have conversion routes on offense now. But what I'm thinking is that we're going to see more zone because it's easier to teach it that way. And the time with players is so limited now at a lot of these levels. And even at the lowest level, that a lot of teams are starting to say, hey, what if we get away from constantly trying to match everything? We're constantly working match rules. We're doing this. Hey, what about this tag? How can we switch up this? And they're leaning more into just pure zone. Like, hey, let's get to a spot. Let's match the receivers. Obviously, we're not covering grass. Let's match the receivers that we have in there. Let's get the high lows. Let's make sure everything, and we want everything to go below us. We want everything down in the zone. And so I think that's interesting. And then finally, two-man. Guys, if there's a coverage that's probably dead, it's probably two-man. We're looking at 2 years at 1%. In fact, it dropped another 0.1. So now we are clearly at 1% with two-man. I've been asked by some older coaches, why do we think two-man is dead? A lot of times two-man was a great coverage on 3rd and long. I really think it has to do with running quarterbacks. You have to be able to run now to play in the NFL as a quarterback. And I don't mean like Lamar Jackson run, Justin Fields run, Josh Allen run. I'm talking about like a Mahomes, a Purdy, guys that if they need to go out, they can, and they can create with their legs if they need to. That's not the primary target of what they're trying to do, but they're going to do that. Mahomes in the Super Bowl was the leading rusher. So if you need to carry a team on scrambles, you can do that. So that's our 5-year coverage review. Let's go into kind of team by team basis. Obviously, the Vikings are going to be the one that really pops in the cover zero. Giants, obviously, with Wink Martindale, who's now at Michigan, ran a lot of cover zero. And then the Cardinals, this is 9-man spacing quarters, guys. They were playing a lot. If you want to watch a really interesting defense, if you are a high school coach, you are a college coach, and you are listening to this, or if you're just a nerd like me and want to watch really interesting defenses, go watch the Cardinals this year. It's not great tape. They don't have a lot of players. They've got Baker, obviously. That's a really good safety, but they were doing some really interesting things on defense. And I just love it that we're seeing NFL teams experiment with things. It may not be working, but at least they're trying to do something and they're trying to mitigate problems. I thought that was really interesting. At the very beginning, I talked about cover one usage. We had the Browns at 37.5%, probably even higher than that. Some of their match 3 stuff, some of the way that they have their banjo stuff and their switches probably kind of falls into cover 3. So they were really high. You had the Cowboys, who are another good one that are really high. In fact, Witt, who got hired for the Commanders to go with Dan Quinn, he's a big cover 1 guy. Giants obviously were a major cover 1 team. And then interesting, the Saints are a cover 1 team. They've kind of always kind of been in that too high. We play a lot of too high coverages, but then we're also going to play a lot of man, kind of the Jeff Hafley who I talked about on Cheesehead TV with my friend Nagler the other day. He's a big cover 1 guy and quarters guy. And so you got to get that mix in there. Cover 3, here's where the Buccaneers come into play. They're one of the higher ones. Cover 3 really is just a spattering of either about half the teams dominate cover 3 in their systems, and then the others are kind of multiple, or they're middle of the field open leaning. But the Buccaneers were really high. They ran a lot of sims this year with cover 3 behind them. The Eagles, to me, I think were very, very interesting. Desai comes in. He's going to run the Fangio system. That's what he was hired for. Fangio decides he wants to go to Miami. Obviously, he's going back to Philadelphia at this next year. But I thought that the Eagles were really, really interesting. They ran a lot of quarters with Gannon the prior year. You think with Desai, you're going to get a lot of cover 6. And in fact, if you look at it, they only ran cover 6, which in their cover 8 system, only about 6% of the time. They were the highest amount of cover 3 in the NFL this year at 55.2%. Talk about a real surprise. That was a surprise to me. And then the Texans, obviously, with Ryan's there. He does such a good job teaching those linebackers those vertical hook drops. I've talked about it before. In fact, I did a video on it. So if you go to the clinics tab at MatchQuarters.com, you can find that there. I talk about him. He's an excellent linebacker coach. Obviously played the position. I think the way that he teaches his cover 3 is really, really nice. Cover 2, we have the Broncos. So Vance Joseph ran a lot of cover 2 this year. The Cowboys are interesting because it's such a middle of the field, close, dominant system, but they run some of the highest levels of cover 2. That is your NTTs. His big changeup is going to be some sort of coverage rotation. It's typically with the safety as the hole drop, and then they pop out both of the overhangs into the deep halves. They play smash quarters or corners, or they play like a trap technique. Diggs was awesome at this. In fact, I've done an article on trap coverage for the Cowboys. You can find that in the archive. Use the search tool, Cowboys. You can find that in the archive at MatchQuarters.com. So you can get a good sense of what they're trying to do. But that is his changeup. They don't really run a lot of quarters, and they don't really run a lot of cover 6. Now, quarters, last year it was the Jets. This year it was the Rams. The Rams ran the most quarters, according to PFF, in the NFL. I think that's really interesting. Kudos to Raheem Morris. He is constantly willing to change what he's doing and kind of evolving his system. Now, he was a guy that was a Pete Carroll guy, cover 3 guy, Dan Quinn guy, and then he has really transitioned underneath this Fangio system. I've kind of become a really big fan of the Rams, that whole organization. I really like what McVay does as a head coach, but I also really enjoy what Raheem Morris has done. You look at Evero, who was with the Panthers, and what he was able to do with the Broncos last year, and then just kind of surviving the season at the Panthers. He's such a great coach that the Panthers refused to even let him leave the door, walk out the door this year. So he will be back as a DC. So he's somebody to look at. And then our cover 6, I thought was really interesting. The Bengals ran a lot of cover 6. Their defensive coordinator has primarily been a big cover 3 guy with rotations into cover 2, and they actually are running more quarter, half. I thought that was really interesting. And so that's kind of where we are, coverage review of this year. Let's transition into what are the coverage trends that we're seeing. I think the topics that are going to be discussed this offseason are going to be the hot blitzes by the Vikings. I think they showed early in the year that you can survive doing this type of defense. Now, it kind of lingered off. It kind of lost its luster. It kind of got a little stale as the season went on because it became predictable. I thought the Packers had a great idea against them. They just said, look, we feel like we can protect. We don't think the defensive line and the movements, because they don't really move that much. The blitz packages, we feel like we can kind of pick them up. A lot of edge pressures, not a lot of internal pressure. And so they just decided we're just going to throw vertical. And when you have DBs that are flat-footed and you've got really fast receivers that are just running the space, it becomes really difficult. I thought the Packers had a good plan for that. The Vikings hot blitzes, though, especially the hot quarter stuff that they were doing with the 5 across, it really translates to a lot of different levels. I think a lot of coaches are going to see, hey, they like to look at anomalies. I like to as well. Who's doing weird stuff? Who's doing more with less? I thought the Vikings did a really good job doing some stuff with their hot pressures. 2 hot underneath. In fact, Brian Flores talked about his time with the Steelers last year was really critical to him. He got to sit in with Pat Narduzzi, really kind of get the nuts and bolts of the coverage, and then he kind of ran with it in the NFL and kind of created his own ecosystem. And as it went on, it became a little too predictable. I think that he's a smart guy. He'll figure it out. He'll try and do some other things this year and kind of mix in other things. Middle field open 5-man pressures, I think, are going to explode through the NFL. We are already seeing them at the college level. In fact, they've been around a long time. The Saban system calls them Big 12s. Now, they'll run quarters to one side and man to the other, so it is a little bit different. I think in the NFL, you're going to see pure zone on both sides, but everybody's going to start turning on Kansas City Chiefs tape. They're going to start looking at their five-man pressures, how they're structuring their fire zones and their trap twos. They call it tango coverage. I've written about it a few times. In fact, I love middle of the field open coverage. Obviously, the brand is MatchQuarters, so you know that I love middle of the field open coverage. And so when I see guys doing interesting things from that shell and keeping that shell, I think, I'm always very, very interested in it. I think Spagnuolo with the Chiefs, you're going to start seeing more five-man pressures, which again, Arnsparger, who invented the original fire zone, right? And the event, like basically the root of what we see with creepers and sims today, he called them safe pressures. So these are pressures that you still have a lot of coverage integrity in. So where guys are now going to look is, hey, we're already running some middle of the field open. I don't want to constantly be like, okay, every time we blitz, we go middle of the field close, or every time we blitz, we're playing cover one. I think when you become predictable in this environment, you're going to get caught faster. Remember, defenses are going to fall behind again. Defenses are reactionary. Offenses always catch up, and then they move past, and then the defense has to catch up because, again, they're reacting. Just remember, offenses set the table, right? The defenses then have to kind of set their pieces off of what is in front of them. So the offenses are always at an advantage. And then diversification of coverages. I thought, just going over the coverage trends, I talked about how there are more teams doing more things. If you're going to do more things, how does that change? You can't run a bunch of match coverages. So you're getting a lot of zone drops. You're getting a lot of zone coverages. A lot of these old school zone drops are coming back. People are starting to go, okay, what's the zone dividers for these zone drops? Where am I dropping in cover 3 zone? Where should everybody be going in cover 2? Things like that. I think people are going back. And I've always said this, if you are a young guy listening to this, you're a young coach listening to this, go read old playbooks, go read old books on football. If you can understand older football, it will give you a better look at what's coming forward. I talked about this in hybrids, that the time is a flat circle when it comes to football. We are just moving through different time and space, right? So we have every era has a different flair to it because of how we were all grown up. And so we're just going through it, and a lot of this stuff's going to cycle back. Like, for instance, 12 personnel is the new 21 personnel. I do think we're going to start seeing more fullbacks in the NFL and at the college level. So I do think the fullback will come back at some point and be how do you defend those types of things? Because you have a whole generation of coaches that are probably under 40 that grew up playing in the spread, defending the spread, went to college playing in the spread and defending the spread. And then at the beginning parts of their career, were defending the spread and playing in the spread. So you're going to see, as we get back and as kind of we go back to these, quote unquote, older style of offenses, how is that going to change the defenses? Well, you're going to have to dig into your old playbook. You're going to have to call your dad and say, hey, how do you defend the wing T? Because I've had to actually do that before in a playoff game. Never saw it before. Had to call my dad and was like, hey, man, can you help me defend the wing T? Luckily, he worked for a wing T guru in Kansas City, and we were able to win the game. So I think diversification of coverages, that's going to change the way things are taught as well. And you're going to need more tools in the toolbox because you just don't know what's going to come from the offenses. Now let's transition into pressure review. So what are the pressure tendencies that we're seeing in the NFL? Obviously, the Vikings are going to be the number one that you're going to see. Wink Martindale, I know, say what you want about the efficiency stats, say what you want about his over aggressiveness. I do think that he has some of the best blitz patterns and some of the best protection beaters that you can watch. I love watching him. In fact, I just dropped last Monday, I dropped an article on the Giants in one of their nickel pressures that they use. And then the Buccaneers with their 43.7%, according to PFF, blitz rate, a lot of those were simulated pressures. A lot of them were 5-man pressures. I thought too, with them, they have such good linebackers and they're fast that they wanted to use them in a lot of these pressures. And then off of that too, I want to talk about we look at the Buccaneers also. They were one of the highest sim rates in 2022, and then they dropped that down to 5-man pressure rates. I think we're starting to see camps in the NFL where you're either a 5-man pressure team or you are a simulated pressure team. Now, not talking when I say, remember, we're staying away from always and never, because teams do have simulated pressures. They do have 5-man pressures. In fact, some even have 6 and 7-man pressures. But I do think that you are starting to see camps where teams are like, look, let's just run 5-man pressures. Let's get that one-on-one. It's kind of that Georgia principle that I've talked about before, that Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann have talked about, of like, look, if we get 5 rushers, we can guarantee a one-on-one, and now we can then also maybe even keep that running back in, and so it just buys us time and coverage, but we're also getting a one-on-one. And if I have an elite defensive lineman or elite linebacker, I want to use that one-on-one to my advantage. Because if you look at the simulated pressures, we're looking at the Cardinals, okay, Fangio adjacent. We're looking at the Dolphins, obviously that's Vic Fangio. Rams, Raheem Morris, Fangio adjacent. Ravens, Macdonald, that's kind of that new Raven system that we'll talk about. Seahawks, kind of Fangio adjacent. Steelers were interesting to me. They, typically we're getting our 5-man dog rush, but they were one of the higher ones. And then the Titans, because of even, that has always kind of been a Dean Pease big simulated pressure team. They're kind of always up there as well. I thought interesting too, when you look at stunt rates, you had the Packers who were just stunt heavy. Last year they were blitz heavy. Then he just said, we're just now going to go. Barry was like, no, we're just going to go stunt heavy. Obviously he got replaced by Halfley. Cowboys are a big stunt team, not a big pressure team. Buccaneers are a big pressure team. And then they also stunt a lot as well. But I thought it was really interesting. The 49ers just literally just played bully ball all year. Didn't really stunt that much. And neither do the Chiefs. So we saw in the Super Bowl a very lack of movement defensive matchup where the Chiefs opt to blitz and the 49ers just opt to not do anything at all. So what are the blitz trends heading into the offseason? Obviously, we're going to go back to the Vikings. Hot blitzes. Everybody's going to be looking at hot blitzes, trying to see, okay, how can we amplify these than just gap plugs on early downs? Can we do some movement things? Can we add some different pressure pass into it? To sim or not to sim, I just talked about that. I think we're getting into camps where you're either a 5-man pressure team or you're a simulated pressure team. Middle of the field open 5-man pressures, again, those are going to come up again and again. And then camps, blitz versus stunt. I think that we're seeing a lot of guys right now that are not willing to blitz their linebackers. They want to hold coverage, and then they just want to use their defensive line. That's what they get paid to do, right? So let's use our defensive line. So we're still seeing some of these really high numbers in blitz and stunt rates. And I think, again, it goes back to, are you a movement-based defense or are you more of a static defense? If you're more of a static defense, stunts really just change gaps post-snap, whereas a movement defense is going to send pressure. They're going to move coverages. They're going to do multiple things on the back end. So let's focus now. Let's transition to our post-hiring cycle review. Are we moving on from Fangio? That's going to be the big question. Since 2020, everybody's kind of been like on this Fangio train. I've been on it too. I love the system. I've written probably more than most have on that system. You can find all those articles in the archive. I don't think we're quitting yet. I think we're evolving. I think the system's going to evolve. I think with Gannon, you see a lot more quarters usage. You see Raheem Morris running more quarters usage. I think Fangio, with what he wants to do, you can see he kind of is evolving as well. Obviously, it's his defense. How are they going to transition and run? What are they going to do with the Eagles? I think it's going to be really interesting. I think it was really hard for him when you have, when you're a guy that's not been around a high scoring offense and all of a sudden you're playing all the time. You got a load of calls that you got to make. It can be really difficult. I think Fangio going back to Philly, it kind of one of the things that you kind of saw this coming. It was like, look, he should have gone there last year. They ended up hiring Desai. They didn't like him. Fangio goes to Miami, thinking it just doesn't work out with Mike McDaniel. And so now he's back in Philly. So it'll be interesting to see from him. Morris moves to Atlanta and he brings Jimmy Lake. I think Jimmy Lake, who was at Washington, ran some really good defenses at Washington. Obviously did not do a great job as a head coach, but he did some really good stuff on defense, and primarily against the air raid and primarily against Mike Leach. In fact, I wrote an article called "The Air Raid Killers," and because of what they did against Leach every year, Jimmy Lake, I think that brings you an element of how to defend the spread, how to defend some of these modern offenses. So I'm interested to see what they do. Do they continue on with the quarters, or do they go back to more of a cover 3 base that they were before? Evero stays in Carolina. So we still have Fangio's back, got hired in Philly. He's not out, right? We have Morris, who now got a head coaching job. Evero's still in Carolina. I think he does a really good job. Again, if you want to watch a defense that's doing more with less, he's more a very heavy cover 3 guy. And in fact, these are, like I said at the beginning, Dom Capers, Dick LeBeau. He has Dom Capers on his staff, and so that kind of gives you that's that link in the chain. Gannon gets weird in the desert. Again, I said the 5 across. I really like. He has Patrick Toney. I like Rawlis as a secondary coach. I like Rawlis as a defense coordinator. He's got a really young defensive staff. They're willing to do some different things and kind of mitigate some of the issues they have. So you still have they're still running the same stuff, and then Shula takes over from Morris, who I think is just going to be an extension of what Raheem Morris was doing. It's kind of the stay the courts. A lot of these guys like to hire from within. You do see Desai fired in Philly, but then they just replace him with the guy. So it was like, okay, we got kind of his counterpart. We don't really, that's not what we wanted. In fact, he got fired about halfway through the year. And Matt Patricia came in. And again, I think that's why they were just trying to get through the year. And then you have Fangio replaced by a Raven. So Mike McDaniels turns and he hires a Raven, which is what that kind of is the transition piece that we're looking for here in just a second. We're going to talk about this new Ravens defense. So if you look at the Fangio gang, I think it's really interesting. NFL averages, right? Yeah, the Cardinals and Dolphins ran a lot more cover 0. Remember, I talked about the Cardinals really probably were running more quarters than anything. It was just made quarters. I thought the Dolphins running cover 0 is really interesting. Not a big cover 1 team. In fact, you only have the Eagles, which again, that's kind of Matt Patricia. You got to kind of throw the Eagles out. They were just a kind of a roller coaster all year. The Dolphins did run cover 1, but again, Fangio has shown if he has elite DBs, he will lean into that. When he had Xavier Howard and he had Ramsey, I think that you get more cover 1. But you look at everybody else, the Rams, Panthers, Eagles, Dolphins, and Cardinals, kind of the Fangio gang. They're now running cover 1. Cover 3 is interesting. The Panthers, like I said, Evero is a big cover 3 guy, but everybody else is right around the NFL average. Cover 2, again, you just don't, it's not a big cover 2 system. They don't run a lot of cover 2. They opt to run cover 6. In fact, every team but the Cardinals, which again, Gannon's running the highest amount of quarters. He's not running cover 6, but everybody in this system is running almost double what the NFL average of cover 6 is, which I think is interesting. And then again, you have the Rams playing quarters and you have Gannon playing quarters, and everybody else is right around the average, with the Panthers, because they're running cover 3, not running any quarters. Disguise rates, 55% no disguise in the NFL. So 55% of the time in the NFL, just on average through 32 teams, you're not going to, what you see is what you get. So it's close to 50-50. You look at no disguise. I thought it was really interesting that most of these teams are actually higher than you think, but and then also lower in the disguise. So we're seeing more disguises. It used to be this was the system that disguised everything, right? And then I think guys are starting to find out, kind of slowing the roll, but you do see more open to close. That's where this system is really, really unique, is where you see rates that are almost double what you see in the NFL. When they do disguise, it is open to close. And that is what makes this system. It's the open to close rates. Blitz rates, I think, are also interesting. They're right around average for almost everything, just from that. So blitzes really aren't kind of the blitz. This isn't a blitz heavy defense, but what they do is they run simulated pressures, which again, the Eagles are kind of the anomaly. They didn't run that many simulated pressures this year. They opted for more 5-6 man pressures, which again, I can't tell you why, but this system is about 33% is usually about where you're at in simulated pressure rate. So the new Ravens defense, let's talk about this. I talked about at the beginning of the year, this season, with Mike McDaniel and kind of that transition from Wink Martindale to Mike Macdonald. for the Ravens. So Mike Macdonald gets hired in Seattle after 2 years as Ravens. He's done an unbelievable job with the Ravens defense. It's completely night and day different than Wink Martindale's system. What's the difference? Really, a lot of it has to do with blitz rate and coverage usage. So let's look at all the Ravens defensive hires, right? The Ravens hire Zach Orr, who was inside linebackers for Baltimore. Miami fires Fangio for Anthony Weaver, who was the assistant head coach D-line in Baltimore. The Titans hired Denard Wilson, who was the defensive back coach in Baltimore. And then the Chargers obviously hired Jim Harbaugh, who brings Jesse Minter, who's a former Raven guy who considers Mike Macdonald one of his mentors. So you have Seattle, you have Baltimore staying the same. You have Miami, you have the Titans, and you have the Chargers. You have 5 teams to go along with the 5 teams that we just saw that are Fangio or Fangio adjacent. Now we have this new Ravens defense. It's going to be really, really interesting because a lot of questions are going to be answered next year on, Fangio versus Macdonald. What is the kind of the top scheme in the NFL that everybody's looking? So let's compare Macdonald versus Minter because I think this is going to be really interesting. And again, I've written about these. You can find this in the MatchQuarters archive. Just type in Macdonald or type in Minter or type in Ravens, and you can find Wink Martindale even in that. And I've got them all sectioned together. Coverage usage is basically the same. Minter is more cover 3 based and uses cover 2 more often. And remember, these are just NTTs. So it's not just pure cover 2 shots. They're showing middle of the field closed, and then they're moving to cover 2. Macdonald will disguise his coverages more, but only slightly. Seriously, if you look at their coverage usage rates, it's almost identical, right? It's pretty much the same defense. Minter is more blitz heavy with a blitz rate of 38.6%. Ravens are really at 27.2% blitz rate. That probably has to do with more playing at the college level, having better dudes than pretty much everybody that they played this year. Michigan's pass blitz rate. This is where I think Minter is very different than Macdonald. He is not scared to blitz. 41.8% last year, where the Ravens were at 28.4% in blitz and pass blitz usage. So Minter will heat you up. He likes to run cover 3, and then he throws cover 2 as a changeup. Minter favors simulated pressures more than Macdonald by almost 10%. So this is not, hey, he's just taking the Wink Martindale playbook and he's running with it. No, this is not that. This is simulated pressures. Right? These are 4-man rushes with cover 3 and NTTs behind them. That is what they are using mostly, and it's not even close. It's almost 10 percentage points. So, and then Macdonald favors a 4-man front, but personnel usage is about the same. I only put that in there because Michigan ran more odd front, almost about triple of what snaps of what Mike Macdonald run last year. They will run both of them. In fact, if you ask both of them, their base defense is a 3-4. That's what they're putting installing in day one. But then they're getting into more of a nickel personnel most of the time. If you go 12 personnel, you go 13 personnel, they're obviously going to get into a 3-4 and be able to run everything out of that. The Ravens showed that. Obviously, Michigan showed that. I think what Minter could do at the college level was your defensive end can play a 4-eye a lot of the time at the college level just because of talent differential. But at the NFL level, you're not asking an edge rusher to go inside as a 4-eye and fit the run. That's just not going to happen. So you see more of the tight mint stuff from Minter than you do Macdonald, who's trying to personnel things and ends up being more nickel. So what's the difference? Very similar philosophies, right? What's the difference between Fangio and the kind of the new Ravens defense? They're very similar philosophies on paper. They almost look identical, right? Both stem from the Dom Capers, Dick LeBeau tree. I think that's important as well. You are seeing, guys, there's nothing new in football. Go open up a Dom Capers playbook, go open up a Dick LeBeau playbook. You're going to see a lot of the same patterns, a lot of the same systems that you see today. Capers was Evero's senior defensive assistant at Carolina. That just kind of ties to the knot on this. So you are seeing both systems kind of grow. They're just growing in opposite directions. It's kind of like telephone. We both are saying something and then it just changes over time. We live in different ecosystems, so we get different things. And so it kind of changes over time. Fangio prefers sims or bonus fire zones over 5-man pressures. I think that would be the difference. Macdonald's more of a 5-man pressure guy. Both Macdonald and Fangio systems want to disguise coverages. They are higher rates than a lot of the NFL averages. And then the new Ravens are multiple in coverage, where Fangio is mainly based in weak rotation cover 3, because it ties into what he is specialized in, which is that quarter, half, quarter. So it's cover 6, cover 8 stuff, where I think the new system, Macdonald system, they're picking some of that stuff up, but it's not as nuanced as the stuff that you see in the Fangio system. So let's wrap up the hiring cycle. Let's talk about some other things, because it puts context into what we're seeing. The success of Spagnuolo and Kansas City will send ripples through the NFL, because I think I talked about this earlier. I think we're going to see more middle of field open coverages with blitzes in front of them. People are going to start structuring that. Zimmer is back. So Zimmer gets hired as the Cowboys defensive coordinator. This is kind of like an older guy, right? He's established. He's been around the NFL for a long time, but he is not averse to running middle of the field open coverages. He just is not very blitz heavy. I think that will change, but he is a 50-50 usage guy, which fits the NFL model of what teams want right now. Shane Bowen, who was with the Titans, kind of a Dean Pease, middle of the field open guy, is now with the Giants. So the Giants are like, they went wholesale from face melter defense to, hey, now we're going to kind of be smoke and mirrors. We're going to play simulated pressures, middle field open coverage, kind of multiple usage of different things. Eric Washington for the Bills is hired in Chicago. Will Eberflus add a quarters flair to his already Tampa 2 defense? I think that's going to be interesting. Now, Eric Washington is a defensive line guy. Chicago went out and got Sweat from the Commanders this year. They really want to have and need to have better defensive line play for them to be successful, especially as much zone coverage as they're playing. And so I think that's an interesting hire. And then Nielsen to the Jaguars. So we have Nielsen did a good job with the Falcons. In fact, I think a lot of the problems on offense got overshadowed his success on defense with the Falcons. He comes from that Saints systems that, again, runs a lot of cover 1, but will also run a lot of middle of the field open coverage. So what you're seeing in the NFL right now is that the Fangio system is pretty much staying status quo. Brandon Staley's kind of the last guy out there that is looking for a job. He may send out this year. He may not. He may be the 49ers' next defense coordinator. I don't know. But you still have the Fangio system roots and Fangio adjacent. You're seeing just a diaspora of the new Ravens defense, which, again, it never went away. It just kind of evolved into something different. And then you have other teams like the Chiefs with Spagnuolo. A lot of people are going to look at them. And then you have kind of these other things like Zimmer with the Cowboys. You have Shane Bowen with the Giants, Eric Washington from the Bills. These are all teams that are going to run simulated pressures. These are all teams that are going to run middle of the field open coverage. And then Nielsen to the Jaguars is again, that's somebody who runs quarters at a high rate. And so you're seeing kind of this change in the NFL of, hey, don't necessarily need to run one thing. We want to run multiple things. We want to run 50-50 almost. I think we're going to get closer to 50-50 next year. Now, other thoughts. Okay, to wrap this up, Schwartz and the Browns had success with cover 1 usage. I think that cannot go unstated. They kind of set the plan for the Chiefs against the 49ers, much like Fangio set the front for Bill Belichick against the McVay system in 2017. So you kind of have Schwartz out there who kind of comes back in as a defensive coordinator, runs a lot of cover 1, runs a lot of just jet front, up front, gap plug, get after it, mitigate a lot of issues through coverage, cover 1 usage, just covering everything up. Halfley is the hire in Green Bay. That's a cover 1 guy. And then you're going to get some quarters. So here we have 2 examples of cover 1. The Commanders go with Quinn. Quinn hires Witt to go with him. That's cover 1 usage as well. Chiefs and Browns game plan against the 49ers was cover 1 base. So that's the big question to me as we go into next season is, will we see a rise in cover 1 usage? Or was just one of those things that it was kind of the flavor of the season and where it goes. Vikings and Chiefs will be the top studies. And then static versus movement. The offensive question is now on the other side. So do you want to just sit and see what you got and play it, or do you need to start moving around? I think those are going to be the questions heading into the offseason. Again, I want to thank you for joining me on this ArtofX show. Make sure to go to MatchQuarters.com. Make sure to subscribe. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast, like and share this. It help grow the brand, help grow the community. You can find me on Twitter. You can find at the_coach_A. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok, and really anywhere you social, just type in Match Quarters. Thank you again for joining me today.